Welcome to Unbelievable, the show that brings Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate. And you can be part of conversations that matter every week via our app, newsletter and podcast at premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable. World War I resulted in over 18 million deaths and 23 million wounded. 2 decades later, World War II would produce even more casualties. Today, as we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, we're asking whether the cost of the lives given in the cause of such wars was justified. I'm joined today by two eminent thinkers, Nigel Biggar and Michael Ruse, as we discuss the question, is war justified by Christianity and nature? Nigel and Michael, welcome along to the programme. It's great to have you both with me. We'll start with you, Nigel. You are the Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Oxford University. What exactly does that mean?
It means mainly that I teach and I do research in Christian ethics. I teach and research quite broadly. I've done ethics of peace as well as the ethics of war. But I also have a role as a canon of Christ Church because I am an ordained priest in the Church of England.
You've defended just war theory in your academic work, most especially with your book In Defence of War, which came out in 2013. In a sense, making the case against what has been a growing movement, I think, of Christian pacifism to some extent. So what's particularly led you down that particular route? Why have you decided to make that the focus of your academic work?
I think particularly, I do have a sense a lot of my Christian fellow believers, like a lot of secular humanists, don't really grasp the nettle of what international politics actually involves. So I think they're unrealistic. Of course, no one disputes that war is enormously damaging, and it's extremely hazardous because once you start it, you don't know quite where it's going to go. So you don't want to engage in it unless you really, really, really have to. So by all means, let's try negotiation. Let's try and resolve conflict without resorting to force. But there are occasions, it seems to me, clear occasions when, if you want to protect the innocent, either you use force or you don't protect them.
We covered this obviously in 4 years ago now,
yes,
actually, when you came on with Stanley Hauerwas, who's well known as a proponent of a pacifist view in Christian terms. But when it comes to World War I, you would make a case that it was justified ultimately, despite that great death toll that I mentioned just now.
Well, you can't talk about World War I being justified because what you're really talking about is you have to talk about whether Britain was justified in going to war and whether Germany was justified in attacking France. So you've got to disaggregate it. But I do think, in fact, the British government made the right decision. I mean, the costs were awful, but as you mentioned, the costs in World War II were 3 times or 4 times as awful, and yet 95% of Anglo-Saxons, at least whenever I've raised this in front of a British or even an American audience, 95% think that World War II, in spite of things that were done wrongly by the Allies, in spite of that, was right.
On balance, yeah.
So the cost in World War I was really awful. That doesn't necessarily say it was wrong to do.
We'll come to the specifics of how you argue that case, obviously, in your book especially. Our other guest is Michael Ruse. Michael, welcome back to the programme. You're Professor of Philosophy of Science at Florida State University, and you've written and researched extensively on Darwinism, science, religion, and so on. But you've turned most recently to this question of war in your most recent book. It's called The Problem of War, Darwinism, Christianity, and Their Battle to Understand Human Conflict. Now, you sort of identify as an atheist yourself. What has brought you, though, to this particular question at this particular time?
Well, I think my non-existent God of the Calvinists decided it was time for me to do this. And so I didn't have much choice in it. There are 2 things. It's a good question, Justin. On the one hand, the basic thing, if you like, talking of just war theory, the underlying causes are very much my being very keen on Darwin's theory, living in North America where it's under constant attack. And so I've spent a lot of my life defending Darwinian thinking, evolutionary thinking. And one of the things I it's one thing to attack people. It's another thing to try to understand what the hell is going on. And I've been led to think that the creationists are right, that Darwinians make a religion out of their theory. Now, please understand me. I'm not saying that Darwin was a member of a bishop of the Church of England, Marquet, although in respects I think he was. But what I do think is that Darwinians turn their theory into a form of secular humanism. And no wonder people don't much care for that. So that's the underlying thing. Then, as it were, the precipitating cause was, in fact, as Nigel's already started to point out, the whole issue of war and the fact that we're living 100 years from the First World War. Although I was born in 1940, at the beginning of the Second World War. In fact, I was even in a house which was bombed in the Blitz in Birmingham. So, I grew up with that. But my generation was raised on the First World War. We read Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man when I was, I think, 13. We were joking earlier, people like Kipling were what I got at school in the 1940s. And I was taught by women who were single women. They weren't lesbians. They were people who'd lost their boyfriends.
Right. Yes.
So the First World War was always the thing which hung over me.
I mean, but although you now today, you became an atheist in your life, you were raised in, I think, the Quaker tradition.
Right.
And of course, that has been a pacifistic sort of tradition.
Right. And of course, that's another reason why, for me particularly, the whole issue of war was very troublesome, intellectually exciting at the same time.
Sure.
I mean, let's not kid ourselves. We're academics, so we like doing what we're doing, even if it's important. We've got to take it seriously. But if we didn't like it, we wouldn't be doing it. But no, I for whatever reason, I lost my faith around the age of 20. It wasn't a Paul of Saul of Tarsus experience in reverse. I didn't wake up one day and say, jumping Jehoshaphat, was that it? The ontological argument is false. I like to joke. It was a little bit like baked beans and collecting stamps, two things of which I was very keen as a kid, and they faded, and this did too.
What about your particular view of warfare, though? And has that changed? Do you think of yourself as a pacifist today?
That's the crunch question that I wrestled with, certainly in my 20s and 30s. I came into non-belief as a pacifist. I mean, we were talking earlier. I'm a Christian in everything but belief.
Yes, but the metaphysical side. Yeah.
So, of course, for me, pacifism was tremendously important. And in respect of my father, who worked with the Italian prisoners of war during the war and that sort of thing. But I wrestled with this, and I basically came to the decision that the Second World War was justifiable, that I think it was morally right to go to war. Now, I was no longer a Christian,
right? So
I no longer had to wrestle with the Sermon on the Mount, which Quakers say they don't take the Bible literally. Oh, yes, they do. They take the Beatitudes
when it comes
absolutely
to that,
literally.
Yes.
When I first discovered that Jesus probably did not give these on a Sunday afternoon for 3 hours, and that they were put together by the followers of Peter, I was shocked, deeply shocked. I like to say I'm a non-believer, but a very conservative.
Well, it's lovely to have you on the programme today. We'll get into as well the meat of your new book as well on this subject, because what's fascinating about yours is that it takes both the Christian approach to this, but also, as you say, the Darwinian, or what has often been represented as a sort of Darwinian view on warfare and so on. Coming back to you first of all, though, Nigel, you come in for criticism in Michael's book because of your defence of war and the particular. Yes,
me.
Are you going to mention the name of the book?
I'm sure. Well, yes, I've mentioned it's In Defence of War. That's the name of Nigel's book, but in The Problem of War, Michael critiques you. Before we get to Michael's critique, what is the general case, if you like, if you could sum up in a nutshell some of the specific reasons and how they tie into the Christian story, the Christian theology of the case for a just war?
A case for a just war, not just the First World War.
Not just the First World War.
Okay, so Christian proponents of just war share with pacifists the idea that if we can resolve conflict peacefully, we damn well should. Therefore, you never think about going to war unless it's a last resort. That's one of the criteria. What's more, you can't go to war just because, Michael might be sitting on some really, really valuable gold mines there. It can't be justified for me to go to war with him just to shove him off the gold mines because I want the resource. So every just war has to have a just cause. What's a just cause? There has to be some grave wrong being done to some innocent people. So any just war has to have the basic form of the defense or rescue of the innocent. And what's more, let's suppose Michael's an innocent. We know he isn't, but let's suppose he's an innocent. And let's suppose you're attacking Michael. So I intervene on Michael's behalf on Michael's behalf against you. So I have just cause, but actually I don't really care about Michael. I want the gold he's sitting on. Mm-hmm. So just cause and right intention. My intention has to be to rescue him. And I mean, there are about, in terms of going to war, there are about 5 or 6 criteria.
And you draw on for those from people before you, obviously.
Yeah, so I mean, the Christian just war tradition goes back. Certainly, Augustine in the early 5th century, 400s, is probably the patriarch. Before him, in the late 300s, Ambrose began to adumbrate some ideas. So Augustine, in a very unsystematic, fragmentary way, begins to articulate when the use of force by Christians might be justified. And he does it partly because he's got a number of Christian military officers writing to him saying, how do I square my public responsibility with my Christian faith? So he gives pastoral advice.
And at a very simple level, when Michael comes along with the Sermon on the Mount and says, but didn't Jesus say, to turn the other cheek and all the rest of it, what do you do as a Christian theologian? Because those are the verses that typically a pacifist will say, this is the core of the Christian gospel. It's about not responding to violence with violence.
Well, there are a number of things you can do, but one thing that I would do, and this is what Augustine did, he said, what's at stake here is motive. If Michael is being attacked by you, Justin, what as a Christian I'm required to do is to be well motivated. So I act out of love. I act out of love for Michael, and I act out of love for you in a number of respects. First of all, I bear you no ill will as such. I simply want you to stop you doing what you're doing. So Augustine's critical move was to say that what's at stake here is the motive of love and the eschewal of any kind of vengeance. And if you say that, then various kinds of acts, including corporal punishment or violent force, can, at least in principle, be motivated by love.
What do you make of Nigel's case in the book for just war?
I think I as a now non-Christian, I think there's an awful lot for somebody like me there. If I were a Christian, I think I would still be a pacifist. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't I be? Mm. And I'm fairly certain that I would find it difficult to accept the conclusion.
Right.
As I say, I'm not a pacifist, and I'm certainly convinced it was right on September 3rd, 1939, for England to declare war on Germany.
You're not so convinced of the First World
War,
but
I'm not. Well, that's a good one. Was it right for England to declare war against Germany after they'd invaded Belgium? That's a toss-up, but I'm not saying it was wrong. I mean, because it was awful.
It's hard to call, though.
But of course, where we go from there, either before or since, and I mean, before, it's so easy to say, well, we should have done something about it in the 1890s when it was clear that, the Junker class had taken over, not only Prussia, but the whole of Germany, and they were, into the arms race in the fleet, in the navy, and this sort of thing. But leave that and go on to the one when the war had started. And I think what Nigel said was absolutely right. You do it not only out of love for me, but out of at least respect for your opponent as a person. I mean, it sounds very Kantian, but I think Kant is deeply Christian. I mean, he's very careful about keeping Jesus out of his philosophy, but I think that pietist background is there all the time. And what I don't see, let's say from the Anglican leaders, is any attempt to treat the Germans as individuals. I mean, Winnington, whatever his name was, I mean, the things he said about the Germans, I mean, he was whipping them up, hate the Germans, even the ones who are good to you, kill them. And that, to me, is...
And I suppose you're not in any way tempted to justify all the things that were said in the...
Well, can I just go back just one moment? I mean... a lot of people, looking at the First World War, we think of the trenches and the carnage. We think, my goodness, how on earth could this be justified? But we do that partly because in the First World War, we in Britain were on the front line against the Germans. In the Second World War, we suffered roughly half as many fatal casualties. The reason the Second World War looks better from our point of view is that we never fought on the main front, which was the Eastern Front. That cost the Russians 11 million military casualties and 11 million civilian casualties. So to some extent, we look at the First World War and the cost looks appalling. And by contrast to us, the cost looks less appalling. But in fact, it was just as appalling for other people.
Yeah, sure.
So there's just that point. In terms of the Anglican Church's response to the First World War, Michael did give me a warning this was coming up, so I did some homework before I came here. And
I hate academics.
Well, I had to because I had to make sure. I
Why
mean,
don't you get me talking against Trump? Then we don't have to talk about facts at all.
And I don't want to just sort of pull rank here, but I did yesterday on the train down to London read an article published 5 years ago by Stuart Bell on this very issue, and Bell, for example, argues that Michael's referring to Winnington Ingram, who's Bishop of London, who is widely reported as exhorting his hearers to kill Germans, young and old, good and bad, kill Germans. Now, I'm not an expert on this, but Bell has done the homework. He says actually he never said that. What he did say was that he thought that the Britain's war against German militarism, not Germany, German militarism was justified, and that therefore it was necessary to kill Germans, including good ones.
Right.
But in 1917, I didn't know this until yesterday, 15 German planes bombed London.
That's right.
And there were 500 casualties, about 100 fatalities. And in response to that, I didn't know this, in response to this, there was popular demand for reprisals against German civilians.
Right.
But the Bishop of London opposed it. Opposed reprisals.
That's interesting.
Please read my book, because I say exactly that. I say these people are appalling, but they were decent men caught in a situation that they couldn't handle. And I use this very example to show, and I say none of us, not even you, Nigel, are completely black or completely white.
Well, of course. I mean, we'll come to your specific criticisms of Michael's case for just war from a Christian perspective in a moment. But talk to us a little bit first, Michael, about the Darwinian perspective on this, because I think it's fair to say that some people historically have interpreted the theory of evolution and its, phrase which can be interpreted in multiple ways, the struggle for existence, as somehow justifying war because that's an inevitable part of the survival of the fittest sort of mentality.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, the big question is to what extent was Hitler influenced by this kind of thinking? I think the scholarly opinion is not a great deal, because Hitler was not exactly a learned man, and most of what he got, picked up in the Doss houses of Vienna. But I don't think there's any question that, say, Friedrich von Bernhardi certainly picked up a veneer of Darwinism and used it for a struggle for existence and, kill the opposition sort of position. Of course, the paradox is that by and large, Darwinians as such were not that keen on it. I mean, they may have been keen on it in the past, but from Darwin on, they all said, I think rather naively, oh, well, we can put this all behind us now and we can be civilized and move beyond war. That's in The Descent of Man, Huxley, Herbert Spencer, I mean, it's William James, they're all saying
Was this the beginning of essentially turning Darwinianism into a sort of version of secular humanism?
We are indeed. Well, I don't think we're beginning, but we're well on.
Well, no, now we are. But
somebody like Huxley, from even before he read The Origin, said that. He said, I'm going to fight religion, I'm going to, but he said, we need a new religion. He didn't say, he wasn't a Richard Dawkins type who said, get away from religion.
But you seem to be saying that's a somewhat naive way of approaching it?
Well, it's always easy to look back on people, let's say India and the Raj, and say, oh, well, these people believed all these sorts of things and how naive they were and how immoral they were. Well, they weren't. At the time, and you can distinguish between decent people and bad people back then. And I think that it's the same with evolutionists. They're naive. They don't have the information. For instance, nobody had any information on human evolution at that time. I mean, they were only just discovering Neanderthals. So to say they were naive, yes, by our standards, I hope they were.
Right.
But it doesn't mean to say that the insights aren't there to be developed, just as Nigel would say, look back on what St. Augustine said, from Nigel's perspective, it's very naive in many respects, and yet I think Nigel has already said, but St. Augustine had ideas there that we develop as we know more about human nature, as things develop, and I would say the same with Darwinism.
I mean, perhaps one of the modern proponents of a sort of humanism from a scientific point of view is Steven Pinker. Now, his latest book, Enlightenment Now, makes this case that moral progress and so on is directly tied to our scientific advancement and so on. And when he was sitting in this very studio where Nigel's sitting now, he said as he showed us all the graphs showing the way that we're increasingly getting better when it comes to warfare around the world and so on, despite what the headlines tell us. And he said, and it's because we've learned to realise through science that we're all the same species, we're all sentient, and we should all treat each other in a certain way. So what do you say to him, the modern proponent, if you like, of why science has brought us to a point of being able to transcend our sort of evolutionary story?
Well, I'm very glad you asked that question, because I've just written a discussion review of Pinker's book for the Quarterly Review of Biology, where I call it curate's egg, right. Good in parts. The bishop says to the curate, I'm afraid your egg is not very good. Oh no, my lord, it's very good in parts. And I think that Pinker has a lot of really interesting things to say about medical care. I mean, I've got idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. 20 years ago, I'd probably be dead by now. But here I am, at my peak on your show. So obviously, I'm all in favour of progress, and I think you can make progress. Where I want to fault Pinker, apart from, I think, his naive hostility about people like Nigel, is that, progress isn't that simple. Any century which had World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Cold War, Vietnam War, and that's before we get to Iraq. Anybody who just says, "Oh, progress now," I can't use the word on show, but it begins with war.
What do you make of people like Pinker and their view that we're essentially getting better, and it's because of humanism and reason and science?
I'll answer that. Can I just go back one step?
Feel free,
mind?
Yes.
Just back to the issue of Darwinism, World War I, because I think it's a really enlightening contrast here. Michael mentioned Bernhardi, who was was he a German foreign minister who was? He
was a member of the General Staff.
That's right. But in the First World War, the chief of the German General Staff was Helmut von Moltke, and there was chief of the Austrian General Staff von Hötzendorf. Both of them were social Darwinists. And their argument was international relations is all about the survival of nations. Nations survive by dominating, and you dominate by going to war whenever you think you'll win it. And in 1912, von Moltke persuaded the German government that the longer they waited before going, the war was inevitable, they thought. The longer they waited, the stronger Russia would become, and the longer the odds would become against German victory. So part of the decision, the decision making on the part of the German government was, we need to go to war now, otherwise we're going to be dominated and overwhelmed. By contrast, in London in the early days of August 1914, after the Germans had invaded France and Belgium, the British cabinet wasn't thinking in those terms at all. The main questions on the table were: do we have an obligation to France? And what's our responsibility as a guarantor of Belgian neutrality? So the terms of discussion were quite different. And although I can't claim any direct influence of Christian just war theory on the terms of British discussion, it was much more approximate to a Christian just war set of considerations than was happening in Germany.
Before we come back to the other subject,
Okay.
we're going to go to a quick break, and we will get your thoughts on sort of
Pinker.
current Darwinians like Pinker and so on, and their approach to this.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.
At the end of that last section, you wanted to sort of come on to the question of people like Steven Pinker today, who say we are living in an age where we're seeing things get better all the time. And in fact, despite what Michael said about all the bloodshed of the 20th century, I think when he looks at the actual graphs and statistics and per capita and all the rest of it, he says actually the fact is we're living in more peaceful times than we ever have in history and so on. And he ties this directly to the advancement of science and humanism, the Enlightenment and so on. Where do you come down on all that?
Well, perhaps surprisingly, I'm rather like Michael on this. The question of whether we have in fact become more peaceful worldwide is an empirical question. I just observe that Steven Pinker is a cognitive psychologist. He's not an historian, and nor is he a political scientist. And at least two people one historian and I think another cultural historian, have questioned really whether it's possible, as Pinker tries to do, to take a wide variety of different kinds of violence worldwide over 7,000 years and quantify it. I mean, can you really do that? So when I first heard about Pinker's thesis, I was just initially very skeptical, just in terms of whether we actually know. And then prima facie, given the history of the 20th century, it certainly doesn't look like we progressed, because surely the not just First and Second World Wars, but Stalin's purges, the tens of millions of Chinese killed through Mao's policies. I mean, have we really improved? But, it could be the empirical evidence will show that Michael and I are just being too cynical. But I come as a skeptic. And also, yes, as a Christian, I do think progress is possible, but I also think it's fragile, and it's vulnerable, and it's mortal. And Michael didn't say this, but he perhaps implied it, and I agree. History sometimes rolls backwards. It rolls backwards. I mean, I was 13 in 1968, just at the end of secondary school. Who among us then expected Northern Ireland to plunge into 30 years of political murder? 3,500 people killed for political reasons. No one expected it then. We thought we got beyond that. But and that was relatively light. I mean, look at what happened to the Balkans in the 1990s. No one expected that.
I'm sure there's a lot you'd agree with there, Michael.
Yes, I think actually, just to go straight to Nigel, I think there's a fundamental difference, though, that you and I have. You, as a Christian, as a fairly conservative Christian, I mean, I don't mean that in a bad sense. I like to say I'm a very conservative non-believer. But you believe in original sin. At some level, in your book, you make it very clear. You think that thoughts of progress ultimately are not only false, but dangerous, because it cons us into believing that it's going to be a brighter day tomorrow. Whereas I certainly, God, as I say in my book, anybody who lives in a generation which had Heinrich Himmler knows about people being sinful. Yeah. And yet I'm not convinced that original sin in the Augustinian sense, we're sinful, but I'm more inclined to take a Kantian position to say that at some level the sin is not predetermined in that way, but that there is the possibility of good or bad. I guess I want to put human autonomy higher than you do.
Okay. So there may be a difference between us, Michael. It may not be quite as dramatic as you think, because I think Augustine put his finger on something important in this concept of original sin. I mean, he saw it mainly in terms of sexual desire. Because if you read his Confessions,
it's okay for him. He'd already had it.
Yeah, well, he had a lot of it, and he found it hard to control. And I many of us would sympathise with him on that. But the idea that we are free, we are human beings dignified with the possibility of free choices. But I would have, speaking for myself, and certainly Augustine felt this, experienced this, that we are landed biologically, sometimes with forces, by family and history, with all sorts of constraints and distortions that constrain our freedom. So it's a struggle sometimes to be autonomous, and I think that's wise. There are different readings of Augustine. Some people read him as being very pessimistic. Other people say no, it wasn't quite that bad. I guess insofar as he was a Christian, he did believe there was hope. But he wasn't going to sign up to any kind of easy hope or any notion of progress as secure and continuous.
Can I just understand from you, first of all, Michael, what your problem is with this idea of original sin? Is it that you fear that what is essentially a theological idea has somehow been used to justify the idea that we are innately born to go to war and that sort of thing?
Well, obviously at one level you could say that, but that's not really why I object to original sin. Partly I object to original sin on the idea that because Adam sinned, we're all sinful, which of course is what Paul says, and I think is what Augustine believes. And I just don't buy into Adam and Eve. Yeah. So I think a Christian can take a different position, incarnational theology of Jesus as a great leader or a great example who's with us always, and these sorts of things. So that's not really my worry. Let's go right to your book, Nigel, and probably the most shocking statement that you make. It's shocking in the sense of shocks. Apart from the second Iraq War, which is a second shock, but the first shock is the Battle of the Somme, where 20,000 young Brits lost their lives on the first day, and was it 60,000? Of course, for me, having lived many years in Canada, Newfoundland, where, 750 went over the top on July 1st, and there were 68 answering roll call on the next day. That's what worries me, Nigel. And you say, if more had been demanded, I think from a Christian perspective, it could be justified. And I want to say, somehow, I think if I use the word morbid, I'm not using this, I'm trying not to be too emotive, but your morbid conviction that we're going to be sinners kind of eases you into making that kind of judgment. Whereas somebody like me wants to say, it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. How can we... the Battle of the Marne at the beginning of the war showed us what was going to happen, how many people were going to die. I think that you Anglicans should have been up there crying bloody murder like Bishop Bell in the Second World War and saying, we have to stop this. We have to stop this. Winnington Ingram, he was a German speaker. He said before the war, we all love Germans. Why, how could Temple preach to his boys, go to war? 350 of his boys died. He was headmaster of Repton, yes. The usual step up to being a bishop. And that's what worries me, is I think that your belief in original sin
gives a license somehow to...
as it were, some sort of fatalistic, is that the word I'm looking for? In some sort of way that I don't have.
You don't. There's an inevitability and a license almost for war because of the nature that we have as human beings. It seems to be what Michael's.
Yeah, I don't myself think that's the problem. Though let me say, Michael, when I did make that remark about First World War cost, the war against German militarism in 1914 to 18 cost, 20 million. Would it have been worth 30 or 40 or 50? I was perplexed about the logic of that, but because I recognise that war as a means of doing justice is enormously costly, and once you start it, it's very hard to know where it's going to end. But the question of how much it's worth paying in terms of human life for justice is, I think, a very difficult one to answer. And so, if you think, as Michael and I both apparently think, that the war against Hitler was justified, well, it cost the lives of between 60 and 80 million people to put an end to the Hitlerian regime and their Japanese allies. And most of us, when we raise our hands and say, yes, we think it was, the war against Hitler was justified, are in effect saying it was worth it. Mm-hmm. It was worth 80 million. Okay. Would it not have been worth 150 million? I mean, I don't know how to answer that question.
I mean, is there a way of answering that? I mean, is there a point at which you would say actually capitulation, even to an evil dictator, is better than the expense of human life?
Well, the First World War, and I'm as aware as Nigel is of the complexities of this issue, and I agree with Nigel. I mean, I think the First World War was caused by the Junker class in Germany having altogether too much power. So we're on the same side there. I don't think it was an equal thing going in. So that does worry me a great deal. But I do want to say Hitler was one thing and the Kaiser was another. The Kaiser was a weak man. He was vain. He was easily pushed around. He got that withered arm. But Churchill knew him and said he was amiable. In fact, Churchill actually offered him sanctuary in the Second World War. As it happened, he died conveniently just before the Germans got into to Holland. So there's a difference there. The Nazis, for me, what they did with the Jews, and not just the Jews, the homosexuals, the gypsies, and of course the disabled. There was a vile sinfulness which, it speaks not only against Hitler, it speaks against Pinker's optimism. It really truly does. I mean, I say in the book, if nothing else, Christians like Nigel Biggar, have put their finger on this one, and I think you're absolutely right that there's something which leads to a denial of easy optimism. So, as I say, I think the Second World War is one thing. Don't forget, the First World War ended not in a victory, but in an armistice. And, just about every historian says, basically, it was the end of part one. We're now going to take a 20-year break and then, to be resumed, which, of course, it was. So, in the end, it didn't really solve a hell of a lot.
But Nigel, I think, is challenging you, Michael, to explain why you are upset, shocked at this idea that he would say perhaps the Battle of the Somme would still have been worth fighting if we'd lost twice the number of young men.
I think
it's about the principle of, is there a point at which loss of life somehow outweighs the need to overthrow
I'm certainly not saying we should have just downed arms on July the 30th and brought out a soccer ball like the first Christmas and said, but that's just silly talk. I do think, though, that we should have been making. Part of the problem is Nigel and I are old geezers. Nobody's going to, line us up with a bayonet and send us off to the trenches. So that's one psychological problem I have. Telling my kids of my children's age, go off and fight. Right. It's a noble thing. Yeah. That really psychologically worries the hell out of me. But secondly, I can't help feeling that after the Battle of the Marne, where so many Frenchmen and Germans also died, that church people at least should have been saying, hang on a minute, these costs are horrendous. Now,
we're not
saying end tomorrow. We're not saying down tools. But, dear God, can't we think some other way about
it? It
this?
sounds like what Michael's suggesting, Nigel, is there needs to have been more of an effort among Christians and perhaps among yourself specifically to find alternatives, that it's too easy to go to the war option because it's justified somehow by your theology, and if we're talking about it as a last resort, well, did we ever really explore all the other options when it came to World War I?
Yeah, I don't know enough about quite what the bishops of the Church of England were doing during the war, but I think we can take it for granted that everyone was shocked by the Somme. I mean, can you imagine 60,000 casualties in one day, the first day, 20,000 dead, right? In 10 years in Afghanistan, what did we suffer? About 500 casualties? Mm. So you can imagine the shock. So and what's amazing is that Britain and France and Germany kept on fighting for another 3 years.
Yeah. And it only ended when America got involved, because then they started to change the balance.
But just one point I wanted to make in terms of the Somme. I mean, one reason we think that that slaughter was unjustified is we think it was militarily stupid. Surely the generals recognised
it was
after
just
the
cannon
Marne
fodder.
It was going to be.
Yeah.
I mean, General Haig does come under criticism, but Haig's mistake appears to have been that he was too ambitious. He kept hoping for a breakthrough, and what happened was that in order to prepare for a breakthrough, he had the artillery fire over much deeper into enemy lines, and dissipated the impact of the fire. As a consequence of which, when the troops got out of the trenches and marched toward the German lines, the front line wasn't as damaged as they'd hoped. So Haig's fault was to be too optimistic. Oddly, he should have settled for something much more modest. But even a gradual war of attrition, which is what his colleagues were urging on him, would have been enormously costly. So it's not clear to me that, and of course Haig only fought at the Somme for political reasons, because he didn't want to fight then or there. He was forced to because of the alliance with France. The French needed relief from Verdun, so he fought at much earlier than he wanted to, and he fought in the wrong place. But the other thing, generally speaking, about the First World War is, we look at the sending row upon row of troops toward enemy machine guns.
Towards their inevitable death, yes.
How crazy. And there's no doubt that, in retrospect, the British Army, alongside other armies too, took a long time to learn the lessons. But it seems to me that the reason for the carnage was that, for technological reasons, in 1914 to 18, or 1940 to 17, that because of the invention of barbed wire and machine guns, because we hadn't invented the tank yet, all the odds were on the side of defence. And because the Germans had invaded and dug trenches, the Allies had to attack. And I often say this to occasionally when my American friends get a bit self-satisfied about the First War, and I say to them, look, if you'd staged your American Civil War 50 years later, the American Civil War in the 60s, 600,000 dead. Right. Just for technological reasons, your casualties would have multiplied by
in a
3,
strange
4,
way.
5-fold.
The continuing advanced technology, though, means we have obviously gone beyond that trench warfare now, and in a sense, there's a sense in which we're a lot more specific about the way we kill people
we can be
targeted.
Yes, we can be.
And of course we use things like drones,
exactly,
which don't involve humans. I mean, the obliteration bombing, right or wrong, I think it was very wrong, but we wouldn't do that anymore. We wouldn't, have 60,000 young Brits die over Germany, because we'd be sending,
And I think the concept of dropping atomic bombs to end a war is almost inconceivable now, in a way that obviously was not at all inconceivable to end the Second World War. I mean, but at the end of the day, Michael, Nigel's saying simply these were the factors that led to why there was such a death toll, but it doesn't necessarily discount the idea that it was still just, that there was an evil that needed to be overthrown, even if 600,000, whatever number of young men had died in that battle.
Interestingly, I'm not saying that I favour Haig, but I'm not one who would automatically condemn him for what he did. In fact, I think very much of Lincoln and his generals, and how he finally found Grant. He needed somebody to win the war. And I think we needed somebody to win the war. And obviously Beatty at sea perhaps. Jutland was not a great success, but certainly Haig, at one level, he made a mistake, but we all make mistakes, and you give him a job and you get on doing it. So that, and I hear everything you're saying about he was forced to fight on the Somme and when he was forced to fight and those sorts of things. What I'm saying more is I think those of us who, particularly those of us who are not fighting, should have been getting up and crying bloody murder. Now, I've got a lot of criticisms of Bertrand Russell, but he was doing that, and so were others, including the Fellowship of Reconciliation, other Quakers, and other pacifists. This is what worries me, Nigel, is you Christians were matey with the Germans before the war, but as soon as war was declared, you did what I call in my book a U-turn and turn it into a religious war. And that's not my phrase. Many people who write about this, and that's what worries me, is that you people, and I would include myself there, weren't in 1915 getting up in your pulpits and instead of saying we've got to fight this war, the Hun is evil, it's a religious war, this sort of thing, you should have been saying, no, this is wrong, we must find some way of stopping this. You should have been going to Sweden and talking to the German Christians there.
So two things, Michael. First,
Sorry.
No, let me push back on your fierce point there. First of all, from what I've read, the Anglican bishops, it's very hard to find blind jingoism among them. I mean, they were convinced that the war was justified, that German militarism had to be stopped, but so were war poets like Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen is often the kind of poster boy for pacifism, and he wrote a lot about the pity of war. He did not write about the futility of war. And in the months before he was shot, just shortly before the end of the war, and he wrote to he's very fond of his mother, and he wrote a letter to his mother of an action taken a few months before, in early 1918, where he led an attack on German trenches, and he said to his mother, "I fought like an angel." Right? He wasn't a pacifist. So lots of people were deeply upset at the cost, but they just felt this was a war that had to be fought. Now, that leads us on to the question of were there alternatives? And you're quite right. If the British government hadn't looked for opportunities to make peace, a decent peace, and if Anglican bishops hadn't urged government to look for peace, then they were callous and wrong. I don't know what the Anglican bishops were doing. I do know that in the course of the war there were a number of diplomatic overtures made, and not until the second half of 1918.
What about the actual pacifist movement, though, especially as it came out of World War I and II? Would you say that was primarily driven by Christians like the Quakers, or was it driven more by humanists and people who were coming from a non-religious point of view?
My sense is in the 1920s and 30s, the sources of pacifism tended to be Christian in that period.
Yes, I think that's true.
If we can include Quakers as Christians.
Because in that sense, all I wanted to say really was it was a mixed bag then, in the sense of obviously some people were getting behind the war and sort of painting it as a war of religion and a divinely sanctioned thing. Obviously others within the Christian tradition were equally opposed to it. And so in that sense, when you say you lot were all for this war, it wasn't just. There were exceptions.
No, you're right. It wasn't. My father was a Marxist, a communist. He went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, right. And then he told me that when Hitler and Stalin signed their non-aggression pact, he said, "I'm switching over." What happened was he became a conscientious objector, met Quakers, and then he and my mother converted during the war.
That's
so it was very much he'd grown up as an Anglican.
So it's very bound up in your story.
I don't think it's to talk about Anglican bishops regarding the war as a religious war is not true. Sometimes, and the Bishop of London talked about a holy war, but what he meant by that was it was a war of of humane civilization, Christian civilization against German militarism. It wasn't. He didn't mean it was an unconstrained war.
Right. And I do want to come back though to this the issue that you bring up in the book of the paradox that you mentioned between Christian and Darwinian approaches, because we've just got a few minutes before we have to go to our final break. What's this paradox that you specifically think exists in terms of the Christian and Darwinian?
I think the paradox is this. I think that Christians, and I include Nigel here, believe that we are essentially sinful. I mean, it's not that we are born having sinned, but that we have this inclination to sin because we're tainted by the sin of Adam, whether you take this literally or metaphorically.
Yes.
And that therefore, in some sense, war is inevitable. And as I said, I read in Nigel's book, particularly about the Somme, I read, as I said, a fatalism at some sort of level. It's not fatalism because you're a Christian and you don't think that we necessarily have to sin. But you do believe at some level there is the twig is bent.
Yes.
Whereas I think that Darwinians, in a funny sort of paradox, had to think that war was a good thing back when, because they're all progression. And I don't think it's part of Darwin's theory.
No.
But Darwinism as religion, I think, is based on the idea of progress, monad to man, blob to human sort of thing. Just as I think, as a Christian, your idea is that of providence, that God is creator and always there. At some sort of level, the inner light or what.
So the inevitability of war is there in both.
Yes. Darwinians believed that war at some level had to be a good thing, but now that we've developed intelligence and whatever and a sense of morality, and Darwin spends far more time in The Descent of Man talking about morality than he does about God. So this sense of morality makes it possible for us to move on and escape. So you've got this paradox that Christians believe that we're sinful, stuck in sin, so war is inevitable. Darwinians believe that war was probably a good thing back then, but now we've got to the point where it's not a good thing, but we're not constrained always. And I see Pinker, if I see Nigel as the almost dinosaur, gone wild expression of the war theory, I see Pinker as even more of a Stegosaurus or Brontosaurus, has gone absolutely stark raving mad about progress.
Well, we'll see whether we can resolve the paradox in the final part of today's programme.
If you listen to Unbelievable with Justin Briley on Premier Christian Radio and enjoy the conversations between Christians and skeptics, then this is the perfect app for you. For the latest updates, podcasts, videos, articles, bonus content and much more, download the Premier Unbelievable app today.
Just at the end of that last section, you had outlined this sort of paradox, the idea that Christians, in a strange way, in your view, do see war as inevitable, part of our makeup because of original sin, and that Darwinians also had a sense of the inevitability of war. It's there in our genes, if you like, survival of the fittest and so on, but that we've somehow, as rational creatures now, transcended that and so on. And how do you resolve this paradox yourself? What do you think, what would you say to the Steven Pinker and to the Nigel Biggar on each side?
I'm 78 years old, so if I haven't, I'd better get cracking on the job. At a certain level, I think life is a mystery. You call me an atheist. I'm certainly an atheist about Christianity. I'm much more of a skeptic, agnostic, whatever it is about the way that things work. My feeling is this. I don't think that war is inevitable in the way that I really think Nigel thinks it is. I suspect it's going to happen. I very much hope a world war of involving atomic weapons won't occur, but who dare say that in a world of North Korea and Iran and
Donald Trump.
and all of these other countries, that Pakistan, Israel. So what I think is we have to keep trying. I think the thing that distinguishes Darwinian ethics from Christian ethics is the Christian says the meek shall inherit the earth. And Darwinism says that's just not true.
The strong
you have
shall
to go out
inherit,
like Thomas Henry Huxley, like Julian Huxley, like Pinker. Roll up your sleeves, folks, and get to work, because guts determination, these are the things. They're not necessarily going to win, but you sure as hell aren't going to win if you don't do this. So my feeling is more optimistic in the sense of saying we've got to work positively, and I want to work with Christians to see if we can bring an end or help an end or do things about this. Because if we don't, we're lost. In the end, every species goes extinct. So at one level, I'm as pessimistic as Nigel is, except, he believes in he's eschatological. He believes in a happier tomorrow.
I don't know whether it might also be the context in which Michael does his work, Nigel, which is American. And I sense a lot of Christians who are on the more pacifistic end of the spectrum, if you like, worried at the way very often a certain type of nationalism, American military might and so on is somehow tied into a sort of patriotic view of Christianity somehow in parts of the States that they see as very against the gospel, what the gospel. And I suspect you probably have reservations around the way some of that is done in certain parts of the American Christian church,
yes, I'm sure.
Let's bless our AK-47s because they're doing God's work.
I mean, American military might is so much greater than anything Britain has ever had, and of course, America has the ability to use it that we don't have. So, if I were an American, I might well be much more cautious about its use. And to some extent, my pushback against pacifism reflects my own context here, where not so much in this country, but certainly in Europe, not least in Europe's most powerful country, Germany, pacifism dominates. And I just think that I think I resist Michael's description of me as thinking that war is inevitable, because in one sense, as a Christian, I'm bound to see if we can possibly avoid it. So I'm bound to work for peace. I guess my view is that there will be some times where if we want justice, it can't be had by peaceful means. And actually, I think Michael and I agree on that.
Except I don't think I'm not sure that it's Christian.
Yeah, okay. Well, many Christians aren't sure it's Christian. But my argument is, along with Augustine, is that Christianity can be realistic as well as Christian. But the other thing to say is actually through, just war thinking came into being in the 13th century. Precisely, it was articulated by canon lawyers precisely in order to tame and limit war. And just war thinking, to some extent, has entered the bloodstream of international law. So in a sense, through Christianity, we have seen progress insofar as international law now constrains war in a way it didn't 100 years ago.
So things like the Geneva Convention and so on are a result of Christian thinking in that sense, at some level.
So at least indirectly, yes, they are.
That's an interesting perspective. Where does all of this leave us, I suppose? Do you believe, as Michael seems to suggest, Nigel, that as a fallen race, if you like, giving it that theological perspective, until, I don't know, some eschatological event in the future when Christ returns, we will simply be a species that goes to war with each other? We won't ever see a sort of utopia that maybe Steven Pinker one day hopes will emerge.
That's roughly right, and I think Augustine felt the same too. As a Christian, we believe in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. We believe in the possibility of radical change, and we look forward to the day when the kind of thing that happened to Jesus will happen to the whole world. But we live in this in-between time. We have hope, and we're called to live according to hope. But in the meantime, we have to cope with serious wrongdoing. We should try and cope with it through persuasion, sometimes through forgiveness. But when it comes to certain characters like Pol Pot or Hitler or Stalin, either we don't do justice or we fight, is my view. So is that fatalistic? Pacifists and Steven Pinker would say yes.
What's your final thought, as probably the most Christian atheist I know, Michael?
Let me say something nice about Pinker for a moment. That
someone has to.
I think it's important to look at the empirical material. I'm not sure he does as good a job. I mean, he says that agriculture brings on peace, whereas a lot of paleoanthropologists and archaeologists and others think that maybe agriculture was the spur to war. So I think we've got a lot of empirical work to do about humans, about human evolution, about human nature, genetics versus culture, a lot of these things. I think we should put major efforts into these. Is it going to be an easy solution? No. But as I like to say, the best things in life aren't easy. So I think I'm more hopeful than Nigel, at least at an immediate level. Eschatologically, well, I'm a non-believer, so I'm hoping for dreamless sleep and not having to get up to the bathroom in the middle of the night, okay?
That'll do you. Thank you both for being on the programme today. It's been really, really interesting interaction between you both. Again, if you want more on Nigel and his particular perspective on this, his book In Defence of War is a good place to go. Michael Ruse, his latest book, The Problem of War, Darwinism, Christianity and Their Battle to Understand Human Conflict is available now. And thank you again, Nigel and Michael, for being with me on the programme.